So what we just before the break, what I mentioned was specialization in the presence of trade can lead to production of more goods and services. Let us see how when people differ in their ability, because as we said, when there is ability difference, they should specialize. And when they specialize, when there is ability difference, then we'll produce more goods. So let's take a simple example to illustrate when individuals differ in their ability to produce different goods, that is, they specialize and there is market for trading of their goods they are producing, then we'll observe more production of goods and services. So in this example, imagine there are two individuals in the world. That is Greta and Carlos. And these two individuals need two goods, wheat and apples. So there are two individuals and they need two goods, wheat and apple, to survive. And they differ in how they can produce these two goods. Both Greta and Carlos, let's say they have 2000 working hours. Each one of us 2000 working hours. If let's say Greta spend all her 2000 working hours, then she can produce 1250 apples, or she can produce 50 tons of wheat. So if Greta devote all her resources here, the resources is the working hours she has, then she can either produce 1250 apples or 50 tons of wheat. And if Carlos devote all his resources, that is 2000 working hours, he can produce 100 apples or can 20 tons of wheat. If you see here, that Carlos has less fertile land than Greta for producing both the crops. Even if he is devoting all of his working hours. So when these things we observe, that we see someone is better at producing goods and services, then we'll in economics what? Yeah. Someone is saying something. Dibyajit Roy?
No, sir, it's a mistake.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay. So in economics, what we call them as absolute advantage or comparative advantage. So here, as we see, this Creta can produce both the goods better than Carlos. So we will say Creta has absolute advantage in production of both the groups. At the same time, Creta has comparative advantage in producing wheat. So you see that Creta can produce both the goods better than Carlos. So Creta has absolute advantage in both the goods. But when we compare these goods they are producing, so if you think say in terms of Carlos, what you are seeing is Creta can produce 1.25 times of apples than Carlos. That is your 1 to 5. That is equal to your 1250 upon 1000. So what you are saying is Creta can produce apples 1.25 times than what Carlos produced. Similarly, if you see for wheat, Creta can produce 2.5 times, that is your 50 upon 20 in terms of wheat. So Creta can produce 2.5 times of wheats what Carlos produced. So here if you compare these two products of Creta producing with respect to Carlos, then we see it is Creta is producing more in terms of wheat. So what we say here is Creta has a comparative advantage in wheat production. Creta has comparative advantage in wheat production. And consequently, Carlos has a comparative advantage in apple production. That is, Carlos has least disadvantage in production of apples. Carlos is disadvantaged in any way in both the goods production. But if you compare with respect to Creta, then Carlos has a comparative advantage between wheat and apples in terms of apples. That is, we say Carlos has comparative advantage in apple production. That is, he is least advantage in terms of what you say in producing apples. So now what we are saying is people or economic agents or economic actors. should specialize in where they have comparative advantage if there is possibility of trade. Now let's look at there is no trade. Initially there is no trade.
So can you explain the comparative advantage once more? This thing.
Okay. Yeah. So so when we are talking about comparative advantage, we see in any way Creta has advantage in both the goods. Okay, but if you compare in both the goods, she is better in producing. Now let's compare how good she is with respect to Carlos in both the goods. So we say in terms of wheat, she is better off by 1.25 times of Carlos. And in terms of apples, she is better off by 2.5 times of Carlos. So if out of these wheat and apple, in which case she is more better off than Carlos?
In wheat, it should be 2.5 times, no, sir.
Oh, sorry. Wheat is 2.5. Yeah, so yeah, that's right. So this is apple, this is wheat. Yeah, in case of apple, that is it is 1250 upon 1000, and in case of this 50 upon 20. Yeah. So what you see here is in which good or which product Creta is more better off than Carlos. In which good?
Wheat.
So the good in which she is more better off, we say in that good she has comparative advantage. Comparative, we are comparing his advantage with respect to Carlos. And we see here Creta is comparatively better off in producing wheat than Carlos comparing to the apples producing apples. So we are saying she has comparative advantage in wheat production. Similarly, now we know from these numbers, Carlos has disadvantage in both the goods. Carlos has disadvantage in both the goods. But in which case he has less disadvantage. So if you see, in terms of apples, it is the disadvantage is the 1 by 1.25 times of Creta, and in case of wheat, it is what you say is 1 by 2.5 times that of Creta. So in which case in which product Carlos has least or the less disadvantage? He has disadvantage in both, but in which case he has less disadvantage? He has less disadvantage. So these are disadvantage. So he has less disadvantage in case of producing apples. So what you say is it is because Carlos is less disadvantaged in producing apples, so he should produce things in which he has less disadvantage. Similarly, Creta should produce in which he has more advantage. Either you should produce things where you are having less disadvantage, or you have more advantage. So Creta should produce in the goods where she has more advantage, because she has anyway advantage in producing both the goods, and she has more advantage in producing wheat. Similarly, Carlos has anyway disadvantage in both the goods production, but he has at least less disadvantage in producing apples. So we say that Creta has comparative advantage in wheat and Carlos has comparative disadvantage, comparative advantage in producing apples. Is it fine now?
Yes, sir. Got it.
Okay. 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 So now, the point we are trying to make was when someone has comparative advantage in producing things, they should produce that good or services provided we have trade available for exchange. Because as we said in here, both Creta, Carlos required both wheat and apples for survival. If they don't produce both of the, if they don't get both of the goods, then they will not survive. So if there is no trade, then they were forced to produce both the goods. Now look at what will happen when there is no trade. So this is for, let's say, the past apples and wheat are for Creta. The second two are for Carlos, and this is the total in the economy. The third one, apples. So when there is no trade possible between Creta and Carlos, so they are in a self what you can say, they are in a self sufficiency mode. So the self-sufficiency mode is represented by here. Let's say, because in the self-sufficiency mode, there is no trade, so each one has to produce both the goods. let's say Creta choose to use 40% of your time in apple production. So since Creta, if she was devoting 100% of her time in apple production, she was producing 1250 apples, because now she's only devoting 40% of her time in apple production. She'll produce 500 apples, and the rest 70% of her time is devoted towards wheat production, and she will produce 30 tons of wheat. Similarly, let's say Carlos choose to spend 30% of his time in apple production, and this is 60%. So this is 70% of her time in wheat production. So he's producing 14 tons of wheat and 300 units of apple. So total in the economy, we are producing 800 apples and 44 tons of wheat. So this is the self-sufficient condition. Now let's say there is trade possible, so they can exchange goods and services. So when there is trade possible, then they will specialize in the goods where they have comparative advantage. Since Creta has comparative advantage in wheat production, therefore she devote 100% of her time to wheat production and 0% of her time to apple production. So she produced 50 tons of wheats. Similarly, Carlos spent all his time in apple production, but no time on wheat production. So he's producing 1000 units of apples and 0 tons of wheat. So total production in the economy become 1050. Because now they have to trade. So Greta has to give away wheats for apples. Let's say 1 ton of wheat is equal to 40 apples. So what Greta will do, she will give away 15 tons of wheat in returns of apples. So 15 tons of wheat is given away to Creta. In that place, she received 600 units of apples. And similarly, Creta receiving 15 tons of wheat gives away or exchange 600 apples for that. That 600 is reflected here. And this 15 is. So Creta left with 35 tons of wheat, and the rest 15 tons she exchanged with Carlos for 600 units of apples. Similarly, Carlos left with 400 apples, and the 600 apples he exchanged for 15 tons of wheat. So now the total consumption they are having is 1000 units of apples and 50 units of or 50 tons of wheat. So what we observe here, you see the consumption when we have specialization. So this part is where we have specialization available with available trade. So when specialization available with trade, then we observe as in total we are now producing more. So you see, when there is self-sufficient condition, the economy was producing 800 apples and 44 wheats, 44 tons of wheats. But now when there is specialization with trade, then we see we are now producing more. So what we observe here in this simple example, when people specialize according to the ability differences and there is presence of trade, there is market for exchange of goods and services, then we tend to produce more. Therefore, that leads to better standard of living. In a self-sufficient condition, here we see each one of them, whether Creta or Carlos, were consuming less of both goods. Now, in this simple example, we observe when there is specialization with trade, they are consuming more of both the goods. This shows that there will be increase in the living conditions. So what we observe here is when there is market, that markets contribute to increase the productivity of labor through your specialization. Therefore can explain that hockey stick type of history we have observed, and by allowing people to or resources in general to specialize in production of goods for which they have a comparative advantage. So your capitalism, which promote specialization because of the presence of your market and competition in the market leads to technological advancement. Therefore, probably we can think that probably this capitalism may be causing this hockey stick type of growth. So can we say that capitalism is causing hockey stick type of growth? As I said maybe earlier, here in this case, we are referring to cause and effect relationship. We are saying capitalism is the cause of our hockey stick type of growth. In general, let's say we are saying X causes Y, X causing Y, when X is the cause and Y is the effect. And usually in science, what we do is we conduct experiments and measure X and measure Y. And then we see the relationship, whether X is causing Y or not. So maybe in physical science, this cause and effect, where we can conduct experiment, we can measure it. But when we make this causal statement in economics, where we want to understand why things happen, or to devise a ways of changing something so that the economy works better. For instance, we may have in economics, let's say policy X will cause change in some Y. One of the classic example is if the central bank lowers the interest rate, more people may buy homes and cars. So such causal statement difficult to prove in social science and in economics, but it is more easily can be verified in physical science, where we can do experiment. So what we mean by causality, the causality is, say, a direction from a cause to effect. That is establishing a change in X variable will produce some desirable change in or predicted change in the Y variable. But we cannot say correlation between two variables, X and Y, as causation. Maybe two variables are moving in the same direction, then there is a positive correlation, but that does not mean there is a causation. So this causation is different from your correlation, because in causation, if you make any change, say you have a delta change in X, that will have a predictable change in your Y. But if both X and Y are moving in the same direction, that does not necessarily mean there is a causation. So this is simply what we can see causations in economics. As I said, it is even difficult to prove such causations because there are many economic factors are in play in changing one economic variable, like when you're saying whether your central bank lowering the interest rate will reduce inflation. But there are many other factors that also affect our inflation, such as how much goods and how much goods you are producing. If you are producing less, the prices will obviously increase. So there are many other factors that are involved there. Anyway, so that is what we call its causation part. But coming to the question, can we attribute capitalism as a cause for our hockey stick type of growth in our real per capita GDP progress or GDP growth? What we had noticed, the kink in our hockey stick of the real per capita GDP and the emergence of capitalism has occurred in around the same time period. That is around that industrial revolution, where this upward turn occurred in our real per capita GDP. At that time also capitalism emerged in the world. Can this be considered as a cause, or this may be just a coincidence?
So it can be considered like one of the causes, no, sir?
So that is what we are looking at. Can we call maybe this is just a coincidence rather than it is being a cause? Why we are saying that it may be a coincidence rather than a cause, because there are other argument of what we call is why this per capita GDP started to grow, or there are other argument or other changes that have occurred during that same time period. Particularly, there is a concept there is a concept called what you call is the pre-thinking cultural environment that had emerged during the same time as the capitalism emerged. So during that industrial revolution's time, there was that pre-thinking cultural environment also emerged in Europe. What is known as the Enlightenment theory. The Enlightenment theory, which is also coincided with this after this Enlightenment theory, the Enlightenment theory which has coincided with our upturn in the hockey stick type of growth. So this upturn occur at this time, or we have capitalism, as well as we have what we call is free thinking cultural environment emerging in Europe, what is known as the Enlightenment, Enlightenment theory. So was it capitalism or this free thinking environment, that is sociocultural environment changing at that time, was responsible? So in such scenario, when we have this complicated scenario like this, in economics, what we do is what we call is natural experiment. If there are some natural experiment we can see, and we can look at those natural experiments, then we can take the help of natural experiment rather than the experiment we do in our science lab to look at the causal effect of one thing on the other. So this natural experiment is a situation in which there are difference in something of our interest. Maybe there are some institutional changes or something has occurred that we cannot attribute to maybe other possible causes. That is what we call is natural experiment. And one of the natural experiment we have in terms of our capitalism is in Germany, the present Germany, which was divided into East Germany and your West Germany after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, this East Germany and West Germany were divided into two parts. Earlier, they were both in capitalist. There was capitalism was there. But after the division, the East Germany opt for what we call is a centrally planned economy, where you have the government is the primary organization which decide the production and distribution of goods and services in the centrally planned economy, where West Germany continue to be the capitalist economic system. Prior to this World War, the most of the industries were located in East Germany. In fact, East Germany was better off in terms of their industrial advantage, location of industrial advantage, and so forth. So They were at the same country, but now they are different. But they are pursuing the different economic system. So in West Germany, we have what you call is capitalism, where in East Germany, we have centrally planned economy. As I said, before this before that we had this living standard same, but after, as you see here, West Germany progress is far more than that of your East Germany. And if you also see countries such as Spain and Japan, which are below East Germany at the beginning of say 1950, they overtook who practice capitalism. So this gives some credibility to the statement that capitalism causes hockey stick type of growth. So we'll stop here today. If you have any queries, I'll take them and we'll continue with our discussions after this.
So here we got the experimental observation by which we just found that capitalism caused the hockey stick growth. Is there any theoretical approach regarding this?
The theoretical approach in the sense I didn't understand.
Here we just see with the respect to experiments or something observation, we are just getting this thing. But
so when we are doing cause and effect relationship, usually you have to, like in your lab experiment, let's say you are giving whether the vaccine is COVID vaccine we are taking is effective or not. How do you do that? Whether this COVID vaccine is causing the COVID to be neutralized or not, sort of thing. How do we do that? This is a cause and effect, isn't so? To look at this cause and effect, what we do is we take some do some experiment and measure them and then test them. So there is not theory behind, means the theory may suggest something, but in when you are testing, probably that does not help. Like probably in your physical science, there may be some theory which you test, then those tests are not successful, or maybe those causal relationship does not hold. So you can have a theory to state that, but in this case, we do not have theory to say that capitalism caused hockey stick type of growth. What we have is we have this natural experiment, and from the data, we have some econometrics techniques where we can test the causal statement. Like say you are saying X is causing Y, then we have some econometric tools that we use to test this causal effect. And similarly in economics, what we have is randomized RTCs, that is RCT, that is randomized controlled trial, to test whether there is a causal relationship. So this is not driven by theory as such that capitalism is causing this hockey stick type of growth, but we have econometrics empirical evidences to suggest so. Yeah, go ahead, Nikhil.
Yeah, got it, sir. Thank you.